Sarah Martinez had always been the strongest person her family knew. At 32, she was a single mother of 3 young children, working 2 jobs to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Her neighbors in the small town of Cedar Falls often whispered about how she managed it all alone after her husband left when their youngest was barely walking. The trouble started on a cold February morning when Sarah didn't show up for her shift at the diner. Mary, the owner, called several times but got no answer. This wasn't like Sarah at all. She had never missed a day without calling, even when she was sick. Something felt terribly wrong. When the police arrived at Sarah's small apartment above the bakery, they found the door unlocked and signs of a struggle inside. Furniture was overturned and there were drops of blood on the kitchen floor. But Sarah and her 3 children were nowhere to be found. The neighbors hadn't heard anything unusual the night before, which made the whole situation even more mysterious. Detective James Rodriguez took charge of the case. He had seen many missing person cases in his 15 years on the force, but something about this one bothered him deeply. Sarah's purse was still on the counter with her wallet intact. Her car keys were hanging on the hook by the door. It was as if she and her children had simply vanished into thin air. The investigation began immediately. Police interviewed everyone who knew Sarah, from her co-workers to her children's teachers. Everyone said the same thing: Sarah was a devoted mother who would never abandon her children. She had no enemies, no debts, and no reason to disappear. The only clue was a strange phone call Sarah had received 3 days earlier, according to her neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who had been visiting at the time. Mrs. Chen remembered Sarah's face turning pale during that phone call. After hanging up, Sarah had quickly ushered Mrs. Chen out, saying she needed to prepare dinner for the children. But Mrs. Chen noticed Sarah looking out her window repeatedly that evening, as if watching for someone. The neighbor wished she had asked more questions, but it was too late now. As days turned into weeks, the case grew colder. The FBI was called in when they suspected the family might have been taken across state lines. Search teams combed through the nearby forests and abandoned buildings. They dragged the river that ran through town. Volunteers from the community joined the search, posting flyers and checking every possible hiding place. Sarah's mother flew in from California, barely able to speak through her tears. She stayed in Sarah's apartment, hoping her daughter and grandchildren would somehow return home. Every night she would sit by the window, watching the empty street below, praying for any sign of her family. The media picked up the story, and soon Sarah's picture was on the news across several states. Tips poured in from people who claimed to have seen her, but each lead turned out to be false. Some callers were well-meaning but mistaken, while others seemed to be seeking attention. Detective Rodriguez followed every single tip, no matter how unlikely it seemed. 3 months after the disappearance, the case was moved to the cold case files. The active search was called off, though Detective Rodriguez promised Sarah's mother he would never stop looking. The community held a memorial service, though they still hoped the family was alive somewhere. Sarah's mother returned to California, broken-hearted but still believing her daughter would find a way home. 1 year passed, then 2. The apartment above the bakery was rented to someone else. Sarah's car was sold to pay her debts. Her mother called Detective Rodriguez every month, asking if there were any new developments. Each time he had to tell her there weren't any, but he assured her the case remained open. The town slowly began to forget about the Martinez family. News stories filled the local newspaper, and people moved on with their lives. But Detective Rodriguez kept Sarah's file on his desk, and every few months he would review it again, hoping to spot something he had missed. He had a feeling deep in his gut that Sarah was still alive somewhere, fighting to come home to the people who loved her. Sarah's world had become darkness. For 18 months she had been trapped in what felt like a living nightmare. The warehouse where she and her children were being held was located somewhere far from home, though she had no idea exactly where. The windows were boarded up and the only light came from a few bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling. Her children, Emma, who was 8, Lucas, who was 6, and little Maya, who was only 4, had grown thin and pale during their captivity. Sarah tried her best to keep their spirits up, creating games from nothing and telling them stories to help them sleep. But she could see the fear in their eyes, especially when their captors came around. The man who had taken them was named Vincent Torres, though Sarah had only learned his name by overhearing conversations between him and his associates. Vincent ran a criminal operation that involved kidnapping people and forcing them to work without pay. Sarah had been chosen specifically because she was strong and had no husband to come looking for her. During the day, Sarah was forced to work in an illegal factory that made counterfeit designer handbags. The conditions were terrible, with poor ventilation and dangerous machinery. But Sarah endured it all because Vincent had made it clear that any resistance would result in harm coming to her children. She worked 16-hour days, her hands bleeding from the rough materials, all while worrying about Emma, Lucas, and Maya, who were kept in a separate room. The other workers in the factory were mostly immigrants who had been tricked into coming to America with promises of good jobs. Like Sarah, they were trapped and afraid. Some had been there for years, and their faces showed the hopelessness that came with prolonged captivity. Sarah tried to talk to them, but most were too scared to make friends or share information. At night, Sarah was reunited with her children in a small room with 4 thin mattresses on the floor. This was when she felt most human again, holding her babies close and whispering promises that they would escape someday. Emma, being the oldest, understood more about their situation than the younger ones. She had stopped asking when they could go home and instead helped Sarah take care of Lucas and Maya. The food they were given was barely enough to survive on: thin soup, stale bread, and sometimes a piece of fruit that was starting to rot. Sarah always gave most of her portion to her children, claiming she wasn't hungry even when her stomach cramped with hunger. She watched them grow thinner each day and felt rage building inside her like a fire. Vincent would visit their room occasionally, always with 2 other men who carried guns. He would remind Sarah what would happen if she tried to escape or caused any trouble. He seemed to enjoy the fear he could create with just his presence. Sarah learned to keep her eyes down and her voice quiet during these visits, but inside she was studying everything about him and his operation. One night, Sarah overheard Vincent talking on his phone in the hallway outside their room. He was arguing with someone about money and mentioned something about moving the operation to a different location. Sarah's heart raced as she realized they might be moved somewhere even more remote, making escape impossible. This was when she began to seriously plan their breakout. Sarah started paying closer attention to the guards' routines. She noticed that late at night only one guard remained awake while the others slept. She observed which doors were locked and which ones weren't. She memorized the layout of the building and identified possible exits. Most importantly, she began collecting small items that might be useful, hiding them under her mattress. The hardest part was preparing her children for what might come without scaring them more than they already were. Sarah taught them to be very quiet when she told them to, and she practiced quick movements with them disguised as games. She told them stories about brave families who escaped from dangerous places, hoping to plant seeds of courage in their young minds. After weeks of careful observation and planning, Sarah felt ready to make their move. She had identified a window in the factory area that wasn't properly secured. She had figured out the guard rotation schedule. She had even found a way to create a distraction using the factory equipment. All she needed now was the right moment when everything would come together. That moment came on a stormy night in late September, exactly 18 months after they had been taken from their home in Cedar Falls. The storm outside provided perfect cover for Sarah's escape plan. Thunder masked any sounds they might make, and the heavy rain would wash away their tracks once they got outside. Sarah had been waiting for weather like this for weeks, and now her chance had finally arrived. At 2 in the morning, when the night guard usually dozed off in his chair, Sarah gently woke her children. She had prepared them for this moment, and they responded exactly as she had taught them. Emma helped dress Maya while Lucas put on his shoes without being asked. Their movements were silent and practiced. Sarah had spent days loosening the screws on the window in the factory area, using a piece of metal she had found. Tonight, she carefully removed the final screws and lifted out the entire window frame. The opening was small, but big enough for her children to crawl through. She would have to squeeze through last, hoping her plan would work. Emma went first, dropping onto the wet grass outside and immediately helping Maya down after her. Lucas was next, and finally Sarah pushed herself through the narrow opening, scraping her shoulders badly in the process. Once outside, she quickly replaced the window frame, hoping it would buy them extra time before their absence was discovered. The rain was coming down hard, soaking them within minutes. But Sarah felt more alive than she had in 18 months. They were free, at least for now. She picked up Maya, who was too small to run fast, and took Lucas by the hand. Emma stayed close to her side as they began their desperate journey through the dark countryside. Sarah had no idea where they were, but she knew they needed to get as far away from the warehouse as possible before sunrise. They walked through fields and along empty roads, staying away from any lights or buildings. The children were scared and cold, but they trusted their mother completely and followed her without complaint. As dawn began to break, Sarah spotted a farmhouse in the distance. She was exhausted from carrying Maya most of the night, and the children were stumbling with tiredness. They needed help, but Sarah was terrified of trusting the wrong person. What if the farmer was connected to Vincent's operation? What if he turned them in? But they had no choice. Maya was shivering uncontrollably and Lucas was coughing badly. Emma was trying to be brave, but Sarah could see she was at her limit. They approached the farmhouse carefully, and Sarah knocked on the door with a trembling hand. An elderly man named Robert Chen opened the door, and his kind face immediately showed concern when he saw the bedraggled family on his porch. Sarah broke down in tears as she tried to explain that they needed help but couldn't give details. Something in her desperation convinced Robert that these people were truly in danger. Robert and his wife Margaret brought them inside without asking many questions. They gave the children warm baths and clean clothes, while Margaret prepared hot soup and sandwiches. Sarah was so overwhelmed by their kindness that she could barely speak. She kept looking toward the windows, expecting Vincent's men to appear at any moment. The Chens were former missionaries who had learned to recognize people in desperate situations. They didn't press Sarah for details, but they could see this family had been through something terrible. Robert discreetly called his nephew, who was a police officer in the next county, and asked him to come over without using official channels. When Officer David Chen arrived, Sarah was initially terrified. But David was gentle and patient, explaining that he was there to help, not to arrest anyone. Slowly, Sarah began to tell their story. She described the kidnapping, the warehouse, the forced labor, and their escape. David listened with growing anger and amazement at Sarah's courage. David immediately contacted the FBI, knowing this case involved human trafficking across state lines. Within hours, federal agents arrived at the farmhouse. Sarah was scared they wouldn't believe her story. But the agents had been tracking Vincent's operation for months and were grateful for the information she could provide. The agents were amazed that Sarah had managed to escape, with all 3 children after 18 months in captivity. Most trafficking victims who attempted escape tried to go alone, and very few succeeded. Sarah's determination to save her children had given her strength beyond what anyone thought possible. While the FBI prepared to raid the warehouse, Sarah and her children were taken to a safe house for their protection. Sarah was worried that Vincent would come looking for them, but the agents assured her they would be guarded around the clock. For the first time in 18 months, Sarah allowed herself to believe they might actually be safe. The raid on the warehouse happened that same night. Vincent and 12 of his associates were arrested, and 23 other victims were freed. The FBI found exactly what Sarah had described, confirming every detail of her story. Vincent's entire operation was shut down, and evidence was gathered to ensure he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The safe house felt like paradise compared to the warehouse, but Sarah and her children were still far from truly safe. Vincent's criminal network was larger than the FBI had initially realized, and there were concerns that other members might try to silence Sarah before she could testify in court. The agents explained that Sarah's testimony would be crucial in putting Vincent away for life and dismantling his entire operation. Dr. Patricia Williams, a trauma counselor who specialized in working with trafficking survivors, was brought in to help the family. She was shocked by how well Sarah had managed to protect her children's emotional well-being during their captivity. Emma, Lucas, and Maya showed signs of trauma, but they were remarkably resilient thanks to their mother's strength and love. Sarah herself was struggling more than she let on. The constant hypervigilance required to keep her family alive for 18 months had taken a severe toll on her mind and body. She jumped at every unexpected sound and had trouble sleeping even in the secure safe house. But she refused to take medication or extensive therapy until she was sure her children were completely safe. The FBI agents working the case, led by Special Agent Maria Santos, were impressed by Sarah's detailed memory of Vincent's operation. She had memorized names, faces, schedules, and even overheard phone conversations that provided crucial intelligence. Her information led to arrests in 3 other states and helped free dozens of additional victims. Meanwhile, back in Cedar Falls, Detective Rodriguez received the call he had been hoping for since the day Sarah disappeared. When Agent Santos told him that Sarah Martinez and her children had been found alive, Rodriguez actually cried at his desk. He immediately called Sarah's mother in California, who screamed with joy and booked the first flight she could find. The reunion between Sarah and her mother was emotional beyond words. Sarah's mother had aged years in the 18 months her daughter was missing, but seeing her grandchildren alive and relatively healthy gave her strength she didn't know she still had. The children remembered their grandmother and clung to her, finally beginning to believe they might actually be going home. However, the legal process was complicated and would take months to resolve. Sarah and her children had to remain in protective custody while the prosecution built their case against Vincent and his associates. They were moved to a better safe house that felt more like a home, with bedrooms for each child, and a kitchen where Sarah could cook their meals. During this time, Sarah began to truly understand what they had survived. The FBI explained that Vincent's operation was one of the largest human trafficking rings they had ever discovered. Sarah and her children had been held in conditions that destroyed most people's will to live. Yet somehow she had found the strength to keep her family together and plan their escape. The media wanted to interview Sarah, calling her a hero and an inspiration. But she wasn't ready for that attention. She was focused entirely on helping her children heal and preparing for the trial testimony that would ensure Vincent could never hurt anyone else. The FBI respected her privacy and worked to keep her location secret from reporters. As weeks passed in the safe house, Sarah watched her children slowly begin to act like normal kids again. Emma started drawing pictures that weren't dark and scary. Lucas began laughing at silly jokes. Maya, who had barely spoken during their captivity, started talking constantly as if making up for lost time. These small victories meant everything to Sarah. Dr. Williams worked with the family several times a week, helping them process their experiences and develop healthy coping strategies. She explained to Sarah that what she had accomplished was extraordinary. Most kidnapping victims never escape on their own, and almost no one manages to save their children in the process. Sarah's combination of intelligence, courage, and maternal love had created what could only be described as a miracle. The prosecution team met with Sarah regularly to prepare her testimony. She would need to face Vincent in court and describe everything that had happened to them. The thought terrified her, but she knew it was the only way to ensure he would never hurt another family. Sarah was determined to be strong enough to look him in the eye and tell the world exactly what kind of monster he was. Agent Santos became like a protective older sister to Sarah during this time. She had worked trafficking cases for 8 years and had never seen a survivor who maintained such clarity and determination. Santos made sure Sarah understood that her testimony would likely prevent hundreds of future victims from suffering the same fate. As the trial date approached, Sarah felt ready to face whatever came next. She had survived hell and brought her children back with her. Now she would make sure Vincent paid for every moment of terror he had put them through. The scared woman who had been taken from her apartment 18 months earlier was gone. In her place stood a warrior who would stop at nothing to protect her family and seek justice for all of Vincent's victims. The federal courthouse in downtown Chicago was surrounded by security on the day Sarah testified against Vincent Torres. The trial had attracted national attention, and media crews lined the streets hoping to catch a glimpse of the woman who had escaped from one of the largest human trafficking operations in U.S. history. Sarah walked into the courthouse, wearing a simple blue dress that Agent Santos had helped her choose. Her mother and Detective Rodriguez sat in the front row behind the prosecution table, providing silent support. Sarah's children were staying with a trusted FBI family for the day, sparing them from having to see their captor again. When Sarah was called to the witness stand, the entire courtroom fell silent. Vincent Torres sat at the defense table just 20 feet away, but Sarah refused to look at him until she was ready. She had practiced this moment with the prosecution team dozens of times, but actually being in the same room with Vincent again made her heart race with a mixture of fear and rage. Prosecutor Jennifer Walsh began with gentle questions about Sarah's life before the kidnapping. Sarah spoke clearly about being a single mother working 2 jobs, about her children, and about the normal life they had lived in Cedar Falls. Her voice grew stronger as she described the morning they were taken and the terror of those first few days in captivity. As Sarah detailed the conditions in the warehouse, several jury members visibly reacted with shock and disgust. She described the long hours of forced labor, the inadequate food, the threats against her children, and the complete isolation from the outside world. Throughout her testimony, Sarah maintained eye contact with the jury, her voice never wavering despite the painful memories. When Prosecutor Walsh asked Sarah to describe their escape, the courtroom was completely silent. Sarah recounted every detail of that stormy night, from loosening the window screws to carrying Maya through the rain, to finding safety at the Chen farm. Several jury members wiped away tears as they listened to her describe 18 months of careful planning and unwavering hope. The defense attorney tried to undermine Sarah's credibility during cross-examination, suggesting that her memory might be unreliable after such trauma. But Sarah had prepared for this, and she calmly referenced specific dates, times, and conversations that the FBI had already verified through other evidence. Her detailed knowledge of Vincent's operation actually strengthened the prosecution's case. When the defense attorney implied that Sarah might have willingly participated in some aspects of the operation, Sarah finally looked directly at Vincent Torres. Her eyes blazed with fury as she spoke directly to the jury about a mother's love and the lengths she would go to protect her children. The courtroom was electric with tension as Sarah's strength and dignity shone through her words. Vincent Torres showed no emotion during Sarah's testimony, but his defense team knew they were losing badly. The physical evidence, combined with Sarah's compelling testimony and the testimonies of other rescued victims, created an overwhelming case against him. Additional witnesses testified about Vincent's cruelty and the systematic nature of his criminal enterprise. Over the next 3 days, more survivors took the stand to tell their stories. Each testimony reinforced Sarah's account and demonstrated the scope of Vincent's operation. Sarah attended every day of the trial, providing encouragement to other victims who were brave enough to testify. Her presence gave them strength, and her survival gave them hope. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours before reaching their verdict. When the foreman announced guilty on all 43 counts, including kidnapping, human trafficking, and operating a criminal enterprise, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had been carrying for almost 2 years. Vincent Torres would spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. After the verdict, Sarah spoke briefly to reporters outside the courthouse. She dedicated her words to all the victims who hadn't survived, to those who were still trapped in similar situations, and to the law enforcement officers who had saved her family. She urged other survivors to come forward and seek help, promising them that there were people who would believe their stories and fight for justice. Agent Santos and Detective Rodriguez stood with Sarah during her press conference, both beaming with pride at her courage. Detective Rodriguez later said it was the most satisfying moment of his 30-year career. He had never given up hope that Sarah was alive, and seeing her strong and victorious validated his faith in the power of determination. Sarah's testimony became a training tool for FBI agents working trafficking cases. Her insights into how victims think and survive in captivity helped investigators understand these crimes better and rescue other victims more effectively. Law enforcement agencies across the country invited her to speak about recognizing trafficking situations and supporting survivors. The trial marked the end of one chapter in Sarah's life and the beginning of another. Vincent Torres was behind bars forever. His criminal network was dismantled, and 47 victims had been freed because of Sarah's brave testimony. She had not only saved her own family, but had helped save dozens of others. Now it was time to focus on healing and building a new life for her children. But Sarah knew that her work as an advocate for trafficking survivors was just beginning. She had found her calling in helping others who had survived similar ordeals, and she was determined to use her experience to make the world safer for vulnerable people everywhere. 2 years after the trial, Sarah Martinez stood in the backyard of her new home in Cedar Falls, watching her children play in the garden she had planted. Emma was now 12 and had become an honor student who wanted to be a lawyer like the prosecutors who had helped their family. Lucas, at 10, was the star player on his Little League team and showed no signs of the fear that had once consumed him. Maya, now 8, was learning to play piano and filled their home with music and laughter. The house was different from their old apartment above the bakery, Sarah had used money from a victim's compensation fund and donations from supporters around the country to buy a small house with a big yard where her children could run and play safely. She had also installed the best security system available, though she rarely needed to think about it anymore. Sarah had found her calling as a victim advocate and public speaker. She traveled around the country training law enforcement officers, social workers, and medical professionals to recognize signs of human trafficking. Her presentations were powerful because she spoke from experience, and her recommendations for supporting survivors came from genuine understanding of what victims needed most. The Sarah Martinez Foundation, which she had started with help from Agent Santos and Detective Rodriguez, had already helped reunite 12 trafficking victims with their families and provided scholarships for survivors who wanted to continue their education. Sarah insisted that the foundation focus on practical help rather than just raising awareness, believing that action was more important than sympathy. Her children had become remarkably resilient, though they still attended therapy sessions with Dr. Williams every few weeks. Emma sometimes had nightmares, but she had learned healthy coping strategies and often helped comfort other children at the foundation's family events. Lucas had developed a protective instinct toward his sisters that sometimes worried Sarah, but overall he was a happy, normal boy. Maya seemed to have been least affected by their ordeal, perhaps because she had been so young and had been shielded by her mother's extraordinary efforts. Sarah's relationship with her own mother had grown stronger than ever. Her mother had moved to Cedar Falls permanently to be close to her daughter and grandchildren. She helped with childcare when Sarah traveled for speaking engagements and had become an integral part of their healing process. Together they had created a stable, loving home environment that helped all three children thrive. Detective Rodriguez had become like an uncle to the Martinez family. He attended Emma's school plays, Lucas's baseball games, and Maya's piano recitals. The case that had haunted him for so long had become one of his greatest professional triumphs, but more importantly, it had brought wonderful people into his life. He often said that Sarah had taught him never to give up hope, no matter how hopeless a situation seemed. Agent Santos had also remained close to the family, visiting whenever her work brought her to the area. She had been promoted to head the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force, and she credited much of her success to lessons learned from Sarah's case. Sarah's insights into how traffickers operated and how victims survived had revolutionized how the FBI approached these investigations. The legal proceedings had continued. Long after Vincent Torres was sentenced, Sarah had testified in 8 additional trials as prosecutors worked to dismantle the entire criminal network. Every conviction felt like another victory, not just for her family but for all the victims who had suffered under similar circumstances. The final trial had concluded just 6 months earlier, with the last of Vincent's associates receiving a 20-year prison sentence. Sarah still carried emotional scars from their ordeal, but she had learned to manage them without letting them control her life. She attended her own therapy sessions regularly and practiced meditation and yoga to deal with anxiety and hypervigilance. Most importantly, she had found purpose in her pain by using her experience to help others and prevent similar crimes. The community of Cedar Falls had embraced the Martinez family completely upon their return. The same neighbors who had searched for them during those first desperate months now celebrated their healing and new beginnings. The bakery where Sarah had once lived displayed a small plaque honoring her courage, though Sarah had requested that it also remember all trafficking victims who hadn't been as fortunate as her family. On quiet evenings when her children were asleep, Sarah sometimes reflected on the journey that had brought them to this peaceful life. She thought about the woman she had been before their kidnapping, scared and struggling but determined to provide for her children. That woman seemed like a stranger now. The Sarah who existed today was stronger, more confident, and driven by a mission larger than herself. Sarah knew that their story would never truly end because her work as an advocate would continue for the rest of her life. She had survived hell and brought her children back with her, but more importantly, she had transformed their suffering into a force for protecting others. Every victim she helped represented another family that wouldn't have to endure what the Martinez family had experienced. As she tucked her children into bed each night, Sarah whispered the same promise she had made to them during those dark months in captivity. They were safe now. They were loved, and they would always be together. The difference was that now, for the first time in years, Sarah truly believed those words with all her heart.